This is a Glenlivet 50-year-old from the 1940 vintage. It's from the Gordon and MacPhail Book of Kells series, and in this video we're going to learn about what makes this bottle so exciting. Welcome back to the channel, everyone, and this time we've got a fantastic Glenlivet 1940 50-year-old on the cask with us. Not only have we got the decanter, but we've got all the accoutrements that came with it as well, such as the box and the stopper and everything else like that. Now, what is the bottle then? So, as we've mentioned in the introduction, it's a 1940 Glenlivet, matured for 50 years, released by Gordon and MacPhail as part of their Book of Kells series, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. But it's just a beautiful bottle. On the front of the label here you can see it's all highlighted in gold and red. It's a very pleasing label. I don't know how familiar you are with these labels, but it's very different, and especially when the time this was released in 1990 essentially. But this Book of Kells series started slightly earlier than that, and they're just beautifully designed labels that sort of make you sort of take note. This one is obviously in a crystal decanter here, as you can see, and we've got the stopper, 40% ABV and 75 centilitres. And if you've watched How to Date Your Whiskey, we've got our 75 centilitres. That was the law until around 1990. On the 1st of January 1990, we changed over to 700 millilitres rather than 750 millilitres. However, there was a bit of leeway either side of this. So the label on this one would have been produced in the 1980s when they were still using that 75 centilitre format, and then it was released obviously in 1990. Distilled 1940, add 50 years, you get to your 1990. So it's a really fascinating bottle, and like the Macallan Millennium decanter that we're going to talk about in a future video, it's sealed on the top with a wax seal, and on the seal it says Gordon and MacPhail Scotch Whisky Elgin. So one of the things that you might be drawing parallels with already is the Gordon and MacPhail Glenlivet 80-year-old 1940 that was recently sold by Sotheby's for £140,000, and it's this that we're going to take a look at next. So as we've just mentioned, Gordon and MacPhail just pulled out a blinder out of the bag. They just sold the world's oldest whiskey in the world, or the world's oldest Scottish single malt whiskey in the world at Sotheby's. It had a load of experiences with it, but essentially it sold for £140,000. Now, the reason why that's interesting is twofold. Firstly, because that's a whopping price for a bottle of whiskey, and also secondly, because it was a very high price, and I think it was a world record price for any independently bottled whiskey. So if you look at that price into perspective, or put it into perspective, and the RRP of that bottle is going to be £80,000 according to the Gordon and MacPhail website. You know, the Macallan Red Collection 78-year-old, which was an official distillery bottling from let's face it, a much more highly luxurious brand, I think is the only word to describe it, because Glenlivet makes fantastic whiskey. It's just that Macallan has that status now, and that was released in the 70s. I think it was about £75,000 yet. And now Glenlivet or Gordon and MacPhail are releasing this 80-year-old at £80,000, which again, you get a nice pricing parity there, £80,000 for an 80-year-old whiskey, and that's what Macallan did with the 25-year-old when they released the anniversary malt. That was £25 a bottle, and their 50-year-old anniversary malt, when that was released in the 1980s, was also £50 a bottle. But the parallels that I want to draw with this bottle are to make you sort of open your eyes a little bit. So that whiskey that was sold at Sotheby's was 80 years old, which is, okay, a massive age statement, but it was also from the same vintage as this whiskey, 1940. It was from the same distillery as this whiskey, the Glenlivet distillery. It was the same bottler as this whiskey, Gordon and MacPhail, and arguably it's in the same presentation. You know, this is a 1990s presentation, so yes, it's in a crystal decanter, and yes, it has its box and its original certificate here, and its original stopper, which all goes in nicely there. And this Book of Kells series is beautifully presented, and if you look at the presentation of the 80-year-old bottling that was sold, it was very much similar. It was in a very fancy crystal decanter. Yes, the box is slightly more elaborate and there's a bit more press releases around it, but what we're talking about here is that whiskey sold for £140,000. This whiskey, it's on our shop now at just over £4,000. And we're often asked, what bottles should you be investing in? You know, what bottles should you be buying? And at the moment in the market, I don't think you can buy and make a quick profit in some ways. You know, everyone's caught on to the main bottles like Private Eye and things like that, you know, but when you start softening your eyes and looking at the bigger picture, you know, you're not going to pick up a Private Eye for 2-3 grand and make a decent profit. However, you can turn your attention to look at the bottles that the market's overlooked, and I would say that this is probably one of the most overlooked bottles of them all. You know, it's a 50-year-old Glenlivet from 1940 for only £4,000. You know, that is interesting to me. And if you're interested in whiskey investment in general, you need to check out our whiskey investment guide, which you can download for free on our website. We'll put a link in the description below for you. You can buy it on Amazon if you want, but it is a free download on our website, and that gives you all the tools and equipment that you need to learn about whiskey investment, and not just to sort of go in 2 feet first believing that you know everything. It's an 82-page 24,000 word overview of the market. And then if you want to know, other than watching this channel, what other specific bottles to be buying or not buying, you need to download our whiskey reports, which you can buy in our shop, and I'll put a link in the description below. But these are very specific reports on how bottles, you know, trend, and what the point of the reports is that data without context is dangerous. So 100% of people who drink Scotch whiskey die. You know, that's a complete fact. Yes, it's a silly fact, but it's completely true. But you've probably got the life experiences and the context to understand that that's part and parcel of it. The guides put everything into context with investments, and we've done the Private Eye and we've done the Folio series. So if you're interested in a bit more about whiskey investment, check out the guide and check out the reports. And now we're going to take a look at the bottler of this whiskey, Gordon and MacPhail. So, as we've mentioned, this whiskey was bottled by Gordon and MacPhail, and Gordon and MacPhail, give you a bit of a brief potted history of them. They're an independent bottler. Now, if you don't know what that means, they're a company who buys casks of whiskies from distilleries and bottles and releases them themselves. Now, this is slightly different to the Scotch Whisky Association regulations today, because most bottles you will find say distilled at the Glenlivet distillery. This one is a massive use of the Glenlivet trademark, but I'm sure G&M got the sign off for that before they released it. But they're an independent bottler, and they were set up in 1895 by James Gordon and John Alexander MacPhail, who were grocers, which is very similar to how Johnny Walker set up, for instance. You know, whiskey wasn't always a bottled product. It was sold by grocers. The casks were at the grocers, and you would take your flagons to be filled up and filled with them. Now, in 1915, it was quite a pivotal moment for the Gordon and MacPhail legacy, should we say, or branding, because in 1915, John Urquhart took control of the business together with his son George, and they've run it now for 4 generations. And it's John and George who had the foresight, really, to start laying down these casks of whiskey decades before whiskey would become a magnificent product that it is today, you know, the highly sought after whiskey that it is today. Because through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, arguably into the early 1990s, whiskey was all about blends and not about single malts. Single malts only really started to take off in the 1980s and then matured and developed through the 1990s. Now, to lay this cask down in 1940 and leave it for 50 years when it could have easily been sold younger is sort of quite fascinating, and it shows that they have the foresight to sort of think about these future generations, and perhaps that's because they're a family business. Now, Gordon and MacPhail's Reserves are legendary. You know, this 50-year-old, when it came out, was a very old bottle of whiskey. I think the only one that was earlier was the Mortlach Book of Kells. I think that was from 1936, and this is from 1940, but I think they were both 50-year-old age statements. They've obviously just released that 80-year-old, the world's oldest Scottish single malt ever released, and rumour has it that it was Gordon and MacPhail that were the source of the casks for the Macallan Red collections. So whether or not there's any truth in that, it's just a rumour that you hear on forums and chat rooms and stuff. But yes, the Macallan Red collection casks have apparently come from G&M stock at probably great cost. But the bottlers themselves are absolutely fantastic, and this, as we've mentioned, is from the Book of Kells series, which is what we'll learn a little bit more about next. So as we've mentioned, this is called the Book of Kells series, or the Dram Takers. Now, what is the Book of Kells other than being the name for a series of whiskies released by Gordon and MacPhail? Well, the Book of Kells is an illuminated manuscript. So essentially it's a written account of the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and it's also illuminated. So it's illuminated essentially as a way of saying illustrated with these old manuscripts, and it dates to between the 7th and the 9th century. On the front of this label here, actually, it says the Dram Takers, adapted from the Book of Kells, circa 700 AD. So since this label was printed, the academic research tends to suggest that it was 9th century now, but give or take, it's a very old illuminated manuscript. And the location of it, or where was it sourced, or where was it originated from? Again, the most up-to-date research suggests Iona, up in Scotland, and it's a very rare, very, very expensive, very, very valuable manuscript of its time, and that's what gave the inspiration to this Book of Kells series. So on the top here, there's an illustration that's been adapted from the Book of Kells, which features two figures taking drinking from one glass, and it does say the Dram Takers at the top, which is one of the other names for this series, and it comes in a number of guises, the Book of Kells series. Obviously we've got this dumpy sort of style decanter. It also came in a tall round bottle, so this is a 1950 33-year-old single malt. It's from an undisclosed distillery, just a Highland malt Scotch whisky. Could be a Macallan. Macallans are sometimes labelled like that. So, but I mean, that's an absolute steal. We've got this on the store at the moment for about £1,400–1,500. So if you want a very high age statement whisky from 1950, these bottles are incredible value. And again, both of these, well, this one's at 40%, this one's at 43%. They're often diluted, should we say. They're not at cask strength typically, but the Macallan Millennium malt that we talk about in another video, that was watered down from about 50% down to bottling at 43%. So it really is a fascinating series, and these Book of Kells releases, there was you do get another sort of like wavy shaped bottle, and you get a few cut crystal decanters, but they typically had or hold in this instance the best whiskies from Gordon and MacPhail. You've got their other ranges like the Connoisseur's Choice and things, but in my opinion the best have always seemed to have been released in these decanters. So there we have it. It's the Glenlivet Book of Kells 1940 50-year-old. It is a very undervalued bottle on the market if you use it, if you measure it against any other number of bottles. We've got it on for just over £4,000 at the moment. And like we've said, if you want to learn more about whisky investment, head to the Mark Littler website where you can buy bottles, you can learn about whisky, and you can learn about whisky investment.